Chapter 6. Which Way is Up? I found a job as a telephone solicitor in San Diego. While there, I was introduced to a company called Housewares Unlimited, and I became a salesman. Spurred on by a passion for success, I saw the houseware business really begin to take off. I was promoted to a field supervisor after 3 years, and in a matter of 6 months in that position, I had a considerably large sales crew. My income had risen greatly, and I was able to purchase a brand new van, move into a beautiful apartment, and furnish it with completely new items. A flexible work schedule allowed me to attend college several days a week where I studied nutrition, which I later dropped for sociology. College was a great move. A high grade point average really boosted my self-confidence, but after a year and a half I knew I had to leave. There was a tremendous opportunity waiting for me in housewares, and I had made up my mind to take the plunge full-time. I was made for business, and this was my chance to excel at what I knew I was born to do. I found myself on the road for weeks at a time with my sales crew, marketing and distributing a complete line of kitchen items from bakeware to hand-blown glass throughout California and up and down the West Coast. I was having the time of my life, crashing in motels along the ocean in places like Santa Barbara, Eureka, and the Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino wine country. Craving a lion's share of all the glitter the world had to offer, I began drinking and doing drugs freely, becoming a human vacuum of cocaine, speed, and Valium. With money to burn and time to kill, I spent wild nights in Mexico by the ocean, drinking and getting high until my body shut down and I slipped out of consciousness. About 7 years into the houseware business, I ventured out and incorporated my own line of gift items under the name of Brass Plus. I chose this name because I knew I would eventually come into ownership of Housewares Unlimited, as the owner was relinquishing more and more of the business into my control. Soon it got to the point where he was only putting up the capital for the inventory, and in a matter of months, I didn't need him anymore. I was on my own. Within a year, I grew tired of being on the road, and with a strong, competent sales crew, the need to continue traveling was no longer there. I settled into my own apartment and went on to launch Pacific Images, a service company designed to meet a customer's photography needs for life. In running Pacific Images, I discovered that an increasing number of people were slow to make their payments on time. To surmount this obstacle, I founded a third company, Coast Finance, which was presented to my clients as an outside agency specializing in handling corporate accounts. After that move, I never had another problem. In 4 years, I hired a sales crew and went on to other ventures. The year was now 1984. During this period, I moved into a larger apartment and began collecting antique cars and expensive artwork. My mindset was, if I didn't own it, I bought it. And if it moved, I bet on it. I spent money as fast as it came in doing cocaine, traveling, hosting parties, purchasing motorcycles, trucks, and gambling. I even made a name for myself booking horse races. The biggest name I made, however, came from what some might call shrewd business savvy. In other words, I was skilled at manipulating situations for personal benefit, as I did in handling my issue with Pacific Images. One example was when I seized an opportunity created by my employees' growing need to rent vehicles for business use. Rather than have them continue dealing with outside companies, I purchased a small number of cars for that purpose. By word of mouth, people heard I had cars to rent, and soon individuals and businesses began calling me. To meet the growing demand, I began buying 5 to 10 cars at a time from auctions under the name of Coast Finance to avoid the Pacific Image scenario, and in 6 months had an established car rental business, Wheels for Rent, with car lot, offices, secretary, and mechanics. This venture was so promising that I started laying the groundwork for franchising it in 20 locations throughout the state. With so much money coming through my hands, it's needless to say that I was always high, staying awake 2 to 3 days at a time. At one party, I was sitting around drinking and sniffing crystal meth, speed, with one of my mechanics as we discussed a problem we had in getting one of my rental cars back from a customer, an ongoing concern. I had taken the matter to the police, but they flat out told me it was my property and I had to handle it myself. My mechanic took me across the room and introduced me to a repo man, someone who specializes in repossession of cars. His name was Big Mike, a 6'7" desperado in cowboy boots and jeans. A bargain was struck and he took off with the mechanic to retrieve my property. They were gone 3 days and returned empty-handed. They went back a second time and after sitting in front of the individual's house for several hours, brought the vehicle back. This one episode of Big Mike presented a quick fix that I found myself resorting to on a regular basis. I also employed 2 of his friends who served in the same capacity. As it turned out, however, they were all ex-convicts with an extensive criminal background. This was completely unknown to me at the time. Their whole existence was to get high, which made them desperate for money and extremely dangerous. Before I knew it, things were spiraling out of control and the car business was in utter chaos. As a result of their activities, these repo men were high profile and drew a lot of attention to themselves. They frequently committed burglaries, assault and battery, check fraud and the like, and were repeatedly arrested. When questioned by the police and they asked the name of their employer, mine was given. This resulted in officers coming to the job looking for them, questioning me about their behavior and having me respond to accusations that I hired them to commit these crimes. The police thought I was lying and kept me under intense investigation. As a consequence, I was in and out of jail at least once a month for misdemeanors, spending days at a time from the business. During my absence, my cars were being impounded and stolen. This, on top of my gambling and increased drug use, forced me to spend more money than I was bringing in, and the business was well on its way to folding. Too blind to understand the seriousness of the situation, I continued getting high with my associates, who were unknowingly preying on me. I had allowed them to get too close. They knew where my cars were, as well as their papers, and even had access to my checking accounts. In addition, they had been guests in my home and knew the value of practically everything I owned. I began to consider them as friends, which was a major error in judgment, a relationship that was quickly brought into perspective when one of them punched me in the face over a minor disagreement. I was left with an entire side of my face swollen and a black eye that stayed closed for over a week. One evening, while approaching my house with my friend Tina, I had a strong sense that this was the night they would try to do me in. Terribly afraid, the 2 of us walked around the block a few times until I calmed down. When we entered the house, I had her stay at the parlor with my golden retriever, Butch, while I stood in the bedroom with a clear view of the front door. Periodically, I would go to the back door and look out. On one trip, I saw my yellow Thunderbird, which had been reported stolen, pull up in the next block. One of them got out and started walking towards the house. I told Tina that I was in trouble, and if I had to leave suddenly, to meet me in a parking lot a mile away, with strict instructions not to tell anyone where I went. There was a knock at the door, and I climbed out of the back window, weaving through apartment complexes, alleys, and backyards until I arrived at our meeting place. I must have run for over an hour. Tina was sitting there in her car waiting for me with Butch in the back seat. She said 2 men entered the house asking questions and were extremely upset that I was nowhere to be found. Concerned for her own safety, she acted like she was mentally unstable to prevent them from approaching her. They left out and continued to search for me on the street. She and I spent a night and a day at her sister's home in Claremont Mesa section of San Diego. Word got to me that these men were still looking for me and were intent on killing me. From the rumors I heard, I firmly believed they planned to drive me into the Mexican desert and leave me there, knowing I'd have no chance of getting out alive. Seeing my life was in jeopardy, Tina introduced me to 2 men who agreed to protect me until I was able to leave the state. Together, we went down to my house and began packing whatever paintings and housewares were left from what had been stolen or sold over the last year to support my drug and gambling habits, so they could later be moved into a storage facility. This was only a temporary measure, because in the back of my mind was a plan to one day return and put the business back together. Around my house, I still had a dozen cars and trucks which we transported to 2 separate parking lots for safety. After thinking the situation through, I realized they would eventually be stolen or impounded, so I decided to give them to my protectors and a few friends who promised to pitch in to help with the move. For 2 days, I rested in the home of Tina's 2 friends. There was a lot of drug use and criminal activity going on, and I spent my time getting high. All I wanted to do was stay numb, to purposely not feel anything because all my dreams, everything I'd worked for was gone. Brass Plus, Pacific Images, Wheels for Rent, and Coast Finance. The next day, I saw this was not a safe place to be, so I grabbed my dog and walked out. After picking up a vehicle I had stashed in another part of town, I proceeded, with the help of a drug buddy, to load my belongings into a truck. Once everything was packed and in storage, I was faced with the disheartening reality of homelessness. I had no other friends nor family to turn to. Couldn't go to Tommy because his wife didn't want me around. In her eyes, I was trouble. So it was me, a car, and a dog. In the weeks that followed, the car was my home. The prospect of a shelter was always there, but I was afraid someone might recognize me and see what I had become. Therefore, the car was it. It was where I ate, slept, read, and did my drugs. In time, the car broke down, and because of my drug use, I was mentally and physically incapable of putting together money to get it repaired. Wanting to get back home to Jersey City, but not trusting myself to do the right thing with any money I might be able to borrow, I decided to get to the airport and have it wired to me on the spot. This would present the least amount of time for me to have cash in my possession. Anxious to catch the earliest flight out, I arrived at San Diego Airport with Butch 12 hours early, planning to make some calls the next morning. With no place to sleep, I broke into a truck and closed my eyes, only to be awakened 3 a.m. by a blinding light shining through the side window. It was an airport policeman. He asked for the vehicle identification, which of course I couldn't produce, so I confessed to what I had done. He then put me in handcuffs and escorted Butch and me into the airport security office. Once inside, Butch was taken away by another officer. I asked him to call Tommy to come pick him up. After being questioned and accused of being in possession of stolen property, I was taken to another room where I was to be detained until the arrival of the San Diego police. This detaining room had a door airport security was using to gain access to the airstrip. I was extremely paranoid and I knew I had to get out of there. Handcuffed behind my back, I was somehow able to get one hand free. Seeing no one around, I quietly walked to the door, opened it, and slipped out. Once outside, I ran across the airstrip and dashed into a dark field that dropped into an embankment. I ran for about 100 yards, then crossed back over the airstrip to a car rental office. Catching a few stares as I ducked into the men's room, I quickly splashed some cold water on my face, tucked the dangling handcuff beneath my shirt sleeve, and made my exit. Running parallel to the airstrip was the Pacific Coast Highway. I walked there and hid among the forested area for a few minutes as I watched an occasional police car pass by. By now I was sweating profusely, concerned that the people in the car rental office were going to call security and tell them what direction I went in. Calculating my next move, I saw a man walking along the highway get stopped by a patrol car. They had mistaken him for me. While he was being questioned, I crossed over the highway to the grass beyond the shoulder and worked my way down several blocks until I came to a barbed wire fence, behind which was a large complex of 2-story buildings. I figured I could use it for a cover until things cooled down. As I climbed the fence and started over the other side, my shirt sleeve got caught on the top of the wire, and I found myself hanging 4 feet above the ground. Suddenly I heard the sound of heavy footsteps and the quick movement of firearms. I was scared stiff as I was certain it was going to be the police preparing to shoot. In a frantic struggle to get free, my shirt ripped and I dropped to the ground, relieved to discover that the sounds were those of Marine recruits drilling in the distance. No one had seen me on the fence, so I was able to exit the complex undisturbed. Outside, I found a phone booth and called Tommy. Soon as he heard my voice, he knew that I had escaped. I told him I needed a change of clothes and something to eat. He said I could come by, but not into the house because Lisa would call the police. By the time I got to Tommy's, it was 7 a.m. We had arranged for me to call him from outside the building to let him know I was there. Then meet me on the stairwell leading to the roof. Having reached our meeting place first, I sat on the top step brooding over my situation. After a short wait, I heard footsteps, and then I stared into the face of my younger brother. Brother I fished with off the back porch of our Smile Plenty bungalow so many years ago. The brother whom I shared comic books with, played soldier, and even shared a bed. Growing up, I was the one he and others always turned to for help. Now I was turning to him. To Tommy, it seemed like the coolest thing that I had gotten away from the police, but to me it was a living nightmare. He handed me a cup of coffee and we sat talking for a while. Then he went back into the apartment and returned with a shirt. As I was changing, he told me I should leave because Lisa was on the line with the authorities. Thinking fast, I had him drive me to the job site of a friend to have the handcuffs cut off. My friend gave me a few dollars and Tommy and I rented a motel room so I could get off the street. I called my mother and asked to speak with the gentleman she had been dating, who through common law marriage had become my stepfather. I told him I was in trouble and needed him to wire me airfare back home. Tommy told him where to have it sent, then left out. Several hours passed. Then Tommy returned with the money. I was disheartened when I counted it and saw it was short. He had taken some for himself. Too emotional to confront him about it, I just thanked him and I said I would send for Butch once I got settled. I caught a Greyhound bus to Los Angeles Airport, 100 miles away, because San Diego was out of the question. There I had a long, heartfelt conversation with an airline representative who showed a tremendous act of kindness by selling me a ticket for the money I had, minus $10 for transportation once I landed. Sitting on the plane, I felt as if I was floating in a dream. I stared at my reflection in the window and could barely recall the face of the excited 28-year-old who had arrived in California in a 1966 Ford 17 years ago. So much had transpired since that day in 1970, I was full of life and vigor. I frowned, but a glimmer of light flickered in my eyes as I realized I was leaving this trail of disaster behind and moving on to a time of getting things back into perspective. At least that's what I hoped. But this hope was coming from the mind of a broken 43-year-old man with no idea where his life was headed. For now, all he knew is he was going home.